What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video for the Dragonhold patch. This time we're going to be going over stamina, DPS sets, and other sort of commonalities between all the different classes in the game right now. So this particular video, like I mentioned, is going to be going over just the sets and anything else that can be pretty much remain constant between all the different classes. So that would be things like race. We'll cover CPs a little bit, although for some classes you might want to shift some CP points around just because of the different ratios of damage types, as well as just monster helm sets, attribute points, wonderstones, things like that. If you want specific class information concerning their rotations and skills, you will need to go to those specific class build videos that will be released throughout the week as it goes on. A full release schedule can be found on the communities tab on my YouTube channel. So this video will be serving as a reference for those different class specific videos. So again, this one is just looking at gear. We're not going over any sort of rotations or skills. Those are for the class specific videos. So let's go ahead and get started here. So this is going to be the best setup for most classes. There is an argument for two-handed front bars on certain classes, but for the most part you're going to be sticking with dual wield on about 4, maybe 5 out of the 6 classes in the game right now. So starting off with monster helm set, we're still going to go with Maarselok. Now, Maarselok is stronger than Velidreth if you have a very organized raid group that is able to have a lot of negative effects placed on the boss. Negative effects include things like your major minor debuffs, major fracture, minor fracture for example, but also includes things like dots and other sort of debuffs such as Zen's redress and martial knowledge. So the more organized raid groups you have, the more negative effects you will have on the boss, which will give you higher damage based on the set effect. So for more organized group, Maarselok is definitely the strongest when it comes to raw DPS, but for less organized groups, Velidreth is going to be the next best option, and we'll go over that when we go over monster helm sets. One thing to keep in mind with Maarselok is that it does require you to bash. So if you are using Maarselok and you are on PC, I highly recommend you rebind the interrupt, which is normally hold block and press your light attack button into some other mouse button click, maybe mouse, the center click, or maybe you have an MMO mouse and you have a button on the side of the mouse you can remap interrupt to. Just makes it a lot easier to bash, and you'll be able to avoid having that 0 stamina regen when or that split second when you are going to be holding block in order to bash. For our body set, we're going to be going with Perfected Relequen, still the strongest set in the game right now when it comes to physical raw single target damage. So the perfect version adds the additional max stamina. The non-perfect version does not have that max stamina, but both of them still have the identical unique 5-piece bonus here, which is what's most important. So Perfected Relequen drops from Veteran Cloudrest +1 for the armor and +2 for the jewelry. Weapons drop from +0. You're going to want this as a body set just because you don't want to risk losing any of your stacks in case you ever get caught on your back bar. So if you aren't able to clear Veteran Cloudrest, don't worry about it. You can just run normal Cloudrest for just plain old Relequen, which is just as strong as Perfected Relequen, just a hair weaker just because that missing a maximum stamina, but that's not that big of a deal for stamina DPS. For our second front bar set, we are still going with Perfected Lokkestiiz. Major Slayer, whenever you activate a synergy for 15 seconds, is a very strong buff, and so this is still the best set in the game for your front bar, perfected or non-perfect version. While you will be doubling up on the Minor Slayer if you're running this with Relequen, there will be instances where you will not be running Relequen because you might be more concerned with cleave damage, or you're just doing sort of trash fights, so you want AoE damage rather than just raw single target damage. So in this instance, because Lokkestiiz is kind of a constant across pretty much both types of builds, both single target and AoE, you still have that Minor Slayer bonus. So while you're doubling up here, it's not that big of a deal, mainly because that Major Slayer bonus is so powerful. So you could also run the non-perfect version. The perfect version drops from Veteran Sunspire. The non-perfect version drops from normal Sunspire, as well as any chests that you find in Sunspire. So the normal version loses that weapon crit bonus on the 5-piece, but the Major Slayer is still there, which is really the reason why you're in Lokkestiiz, so you can still run non-perfect and not lose that much DPS. will also be more substantial compared to Perfected Relequen versus non-Perfected Relequen, just because weapon crit is far more important for stamina DPS, but it's still not a large DPS loss. We're going dual wield here with an axe and a dagger. What's most important here is that you... Oh, I have this swapped. You need to have your Nirnhoned on your main hand, so this is your main hand here, slot here, and you want Sharpened on your offhand here, and we are still running double ravaged health poisons. Next we have the Master's Belt on the back bar, infused with the weapon damage enchant. That hasn't changed at all. You can also run the Maelstrom Bow instead. If you're running the Maelstrom Bow, you're going to want to use Endless Hail rather than Air Barrage. More on that when you go into the specific rotation stuff in the class-specific videos. But you can run either of them. Master's Bow is most beneficial for single target DPS. Maelstrom is better for AoE DPS. Regardless of which bow you use, you will still be going infused with a weapon damage enchant. For jewelry traits and enchants, all weapon damage enchants, and all three should be bloodthirsty. You can also go with infused instead, which is pretty strong. Those infused are going to be useful in cases where you want more damage up front from the first 75% of a boss's health, which there are some boss fights where infused is going to be more important than bloodthirsty, but generally speaking, bloodthirsty will give you the highest DPS. You'll want to avoid using robust if you can help it, just because you don't get a lot of max stamina modifiers as a stamina DPS, so it's not quite as strong as infused or bloodthirsty. For armor, all divines, all max stamina enchants, and you will be going with all medium pieces. You could use one heavy piece as your monster helm, either your helmet or your shoulder piece, but you will lose a little bit of DPS that way, so ideally you want to go with 7 medium. Using the one heavy piece would be more if you want some additional survivability for the additional health, for example. Other set that you might want to run, so we're going to go through each of the different categories. So you have trial sets, then dungeon sets, overland sets, crafted sets, and those are further divided into body sets, which you're going to want to wear on the body or jewelry at all times, just because the 5-piece is a static bonus, which means you want to have it active on both bars. And front bar sets, which, as the name implies, can be worn on the front bar only because they are proc sets, so they will carry over to your back bar. So starting off first with trial sets, we've already talked about running non-perfected Relequen and Lokkestiiz. There are 2 other medium armor sets that you're going to want to have on hand, arguably 3. First one's going to be Twice-Fanged Serpent, which is really great for trash pulls because it just gives you a lot of physical penetration. So this can be worn on the body or the front bar set, doesn't really matter too much. Even as a front bar set, even though it only lasts for 3 seconds, you gain the additional penetration back very quickly, that it doesn't really matter if it's only a front bar set. The second set is going to be War Machine, and this is specific for Wardens, Templars, and Nightblades, because those 3 classes have the cheapest ultimate abilities here. War Machine is from Halls of Fabrication, and it can be a front bar set or a body set. So if you are using it as a front bar, just be mindful of which bar you have your synergy on. So Incapacitating Strike for Nightblades, Crescent Sweep for Templars, or Empowering Sweep I believe, and the Bear Ultimate for Wardens. So you just want to make sure those are on your front bar if you're wearing War Machine on the front bar. The third set, which is useful but not quite as strong as the other 2 sets, is going to be Viscous Serpent, which is an older set which comes from any of the 3 Craglorn trials. It reduces the cost of your stamina abilities by 8%, so that does help out with Sustain. Sustain has gone down in Dragonhold, so it is useful to have some additional cost reduction. But it also has 3 armor bonuses for 5 armor pieces, so you get an additional armor bonus out of it. It also has Minor Slayer and is the only source of Minor Slayer in the base game, so if you only have access to the base game, Vicious Serpent is going to be a staple set for you. Not quite as strong. Ideally, you're going to want to have on the body to maintain that cost reduction across both bars, as well as the weapon crit and spell damage from the 4 and 5 piece, but you could also wear this as a front bar set if it's kind of your only option. The last set I want to mention is War of Alkosh, which is only used in Sunspire for on stamina DPS. So outside of Sunspire, you won't see Alkosh being used, and the reason it's used in Sunspire is because it's just easier to main Alkosh on a DPS compared to on a tank. In all other trials, it is easier to maintain Alkosh debuff as a tank versus stamina DPS. This is a very unique case to Sunspire where you're going to want to have Alkosh. Alkosh comes from the Marvel Lorkhaj trial, and it can be a front bar set. Next for dungeon sets. a few dungeon sets here. The first one's going to be Leviathan, which is the stamina version of Mother's Sorrow. This is a base game set from Crypt of Hearts. So as a static bonus, you're going to want to have this on the body ideally. You kind of don't want to wear this as a front bar set because you will be losing quite a bit of weapon crit on your back bar, so you want to avoid that if possible. Very powerful set here, so definitely want to pick it up. Does lose out to Relequen and Lokkestiiz, but this is a great set for things like AoE trash fights. If you have a Warden or a Necromancer who's able to apply AoE Major Fracture, so you don't have to worry as much for penetration. So really good set here for AoE pulls, and pretty good for single target as well. Beyond that, I do want to point out Tsogman's Warband is pretty nice as well. Mainly for the 4-piece, it adds physical penetration, so you can kind of shift your CP points around a little bit to gain, kind of take advantage of the additional penetration. Really great for two-handed builds because of that additional penetration. One of the weaknesses of two-handed builds is the fact that you have to go with a sharpened weapon in order to get to the penetration cap, but with Tsogman's you don't necessarily need to do it, and instead you can run something like Precise as your front bar weapon instead. You still get a lot of additional crit chance with the 129 stacks, up to 10 stacks, but it's not quite as much as Advancing Yokeda or Dragonguard Elite. Still pretty useful though. It also gives you Minor Force, so you don't have to necessarily worry about maintaining Minor Force or Barb Trap anymore, especially because Barb Trap doesn't do quite as much damage now due to the nerf to dots. So pretty strong set overall. This comes from Frostvault. The last set I want to mention here is not as strong as it used to be, and that's Azure Blight Reaper. Not very strong anymore. Used to be very good for trash fights, but they did change the way that the Blight Seeds work, so no longer very good. But if you're the only stamina DPS, it might be worth running Azure Blight, but if you have multiple stamina DPS, it's generally speaking not going to be as good. I just realized here that I did forget to mention a very important heavy trial set, and that is Advancing Yokeda or Berserking Warrior. This comes from Helra Citadel, and it is a heavy armor set, so you will need to get the jewelry and the weapons if you want to use this set. So you will need to have access to transmutation, specifically jewelry crafting transmutation, in order to transmute the jewelry from healthy into bloodthirsty or infused. This just adds weapon crit, so this can be a front bar set here. Because it is a proc, so it does last for 6 seconds, so it does carry over to your back bar. But if you do decide to have this as a front bar set, just keep in mind that it does last for 6 seconds. So you will need to limit the time on your back bar to 4 global cooldowns, or 5 if you're really, really tight with your rotation, in order to maintain your additional weapon crit rating here. Generally speaking, a pretty good set. It's just a really hard time to farm this set. It's one of the stronger sets in the game, especially when you compare it to Relequen and Lokkestiiz. Doesn't quite compare to them, but it is still a very powerful set. Probably second or third strongest set in the game right now for stamina DPS. Next, for Overland sets, a handful of Overland sets are pretty decent. The first one's going to be Spriggan's Thorn, which kind of falls into the same sort of notion as Twice-Fanged Serpent, where trash fights to get the additional penetration in cases where you might not have AoE Major Fracture. But beyond that, not many other good Overland sets. The only other one that's decent is going to be Briarheart, and it's going to be one of the weaker sets that we're going to talk about. So this comes from Hrothgar, but it is an Overland set, so you can just buy it off Guild Traders. So it is a proc set, so you can wear this as a front bar set here. Whenever you do critical damage, you basically increase your weapon damage, and you also have a healing component to your critical hits for 10 seconds, and this effect can occur every 15 seconds. So in terms of raw weapon damage it provides, it's just a little bit weaker than Hunding's Rage, which is a crafted set, but unlike Hunding's Rage, it does carry over to your back bar, so you are able to run this as a front bar set here. So it's a little bit stronger than Hunding's Rage in that regard, but still weaker compared to things like Relequen, Lokkestiiz, Deadly Strikes, Advancing Yokeda, and Dragonguard Elite. Speaking of Dragonguard Elite, this is a new set from Southern Elsewhere, which is actually potentially pretty useful here. Now you are getting stamina regen on the 4-piece, which is not going to directly impact your DPS. It might help you sustain your rotation a little bit better, which might indirectly increase your DPS, but it's not like a weapon damage bonus or weapon crit bonus, so it's not directly increasing your DPS. But it does give you a lot of weapon crit. Now, the caveat to running Dragonguard Elite is that you have to attack enemies from the front or the sides. Front is going to be pretty rare. There are a few bosses. Sunspire is one of the big examples here where bosses are always be facing you, so you are able to run it there, for example. But for all other bosses, you gotta have to make sure got good positioning going on here, because it will only proc on the sides, the flanks of the bosses. So in total, the total amount of weapon crit that you get from Dragonguard Tactics is going to be slightly less than Advancing Yokeda, just because of that 4-piece stamina regen bonus. But it is easier to obtain than Advancing Yokeda, so it does have an advantage there, even though it is a little bit weaker than that set. Final set I want to talk about is a Citadel set, and it is called Deadly Strike. This is a medium armor set. Find it. Here it is, which increases the damage from your physical, bleed, poison, and disease damage over time, and channeled abilities by 20%. So you can get this from, I believe it is Bruma, where all the medium armor sets are from. Somebody who is more well versed in where these sets can be found can correct me on that in the comment section below. But it is, you can basically have to gamble for these sets, or you can buy it off of guild traders here. So this is going to be stronger on certain classes compared to others. So for example, on a Stamina Templar or Stamina DK, Deadly Strike is pretty strong because those two classes have, in the instance of a Stamina Templar, channeled abilities with biting jabs, or in instance of Stamina DKs, damage over time components abilities with Venomous Claws, Noxious Breath. It's going to be stronger on those classes, but it's still pretty strong on all the classes in the game because you have a couple of dots going. So usually you will have something like Endless Hail or Arrow Barrage, Poison Injection, and you might have one or two class dots that fall under physical bleed, poison, or disease damage. Necromancers are another good class where Deadly Strike would be useful because there are a couple of class dots that will be buffed by Deadly Strike. So pretty good set overall, probably in the middle tier when it comes to all the different sets that I've talked about. But because it is a tradable set, it is easier to obtain than a lot of other trial sets or dungeon sets that you have to farm for. Now for monster helm sets. There are quite a few monster helm alternatives you can run instead of Maarselok, because Maarselok is a DLC set. The first one is a base game set called Selene's, which comes from, as you can surmise, Selene's Web. So this is a single target set, so not going to be any good for cleave damage, unlike Maarselok. But it does do quite a bit of damage here, and it does have to be within melee range. That's one of the other weaknesses of Selene's, but that's shared across a lot of different stamina monster helm sets. So if you only have access to base game monster helm sets, Selene's is going to be the helmet of choice for you. Next set is going to be Slimecraw, which gives you minor Berserk, which is a very powerful buff. Normally this comes from healers with combat prayer, but there are some instances, when you're progressing content for example, where healer uptime might be a little bit low on that minor Berserk. Generally speaking, if the uptime you're getting from healers is going to be about 50% or lower, you're better off wearing Slimecraw rather than some other monster helm set, just because of the amount of DPS that minor Berserk provides at that point. Another good set to hold on to is going to be, if I can find it, took it. The last set, take it out. It's going to be Velidreth. So this is a DLC set. So this is from Cradle of Shadows. This is going to be the strongest set in the game if you do not have an organized raid group or you don't have enough negative effects on the boss. This is mainly because the one piece adds weapon damage, which is stronger than the max stamina from Maarselok. The actual proc damage itself is not as strong as Maarselok with all the negative effects when you start to stack them on, but it's more consistent, and just like Maarselok, it does have a little bit of cleave associated with it. So pretty decent set. So if you are in a group where you don't have a lot of negative effects, perhaps you're not running Martial Knowledge and Zen, in that instance, Velidreth might be able to pull equal DPS or better DPS than if you were to run Maarselok instead. In addition, you don't have to bash in order to proc Velidreth or Selene's, so it's easier to sustain running those two sets compared to running Maarselok. So that is pretty much it for all of the build stuff. There is one thing I want to point out, and that is the fact that here we are using a dual wield. However, for certain classes, particularly Stamina Sork is the big one, two-handed builds are going to pull about, usually, for those classes, a little bit more or about equal to dual-wield builds. So the classes that I've tried out where two-handed builds have pulled pretty much toe-to-toe with dual-wield builds would be Stam Sorks. Stam Sorks, two-handed builds pull higher than dual-wield builds, and Stam DKs, they pull about parity with dual-wield builds, so about equal amounts of DPS. Other classes, dual wield's going to be a little bit stronger, and that's mainly because you have class spambles, which would be the main reason why you're running two-handed, because you want to use Wrecking Blow. So Necromancers, Templars, those two classes, for example, you have class spambles, Nightblades as well, so you don't really need to run two-handed, just because Wrecking Blow does have a cast time associated with it, so it's going to be a little bit harder to get good weaves in with a Wrecking Blow, just because you're getting fewer of them, even though it does provide Empower as well. So if you want to run two-handed, the gap has actually closed quite a bit between two-handed builds and dual-wield builds. If you're going two-handed, you're going to want to go with a Battle Axe or a Greatsword. The Battle Axe will give you better DPS overall compared to the Greatsword, but both are viable options. You just want to shy away from mauls, especially in organized raid groups, because the penetration bonus isn't very good in organized raid groups. Now for other things that are in common among all the stamina DPS classes, race being one of them. Dark Elves and Orcs are going to be your two best races when it comes to raw DPS. Both classes get 258 additional weapon damage. Orcs get 2,000 max stamina and 1,000 max health, so you have a little bit of additional padding with Orcs. Dark Elves, on the other hand, get 1875 max stamina. Dark Elves, however, get 1875 max magicka and 258 additional spell damage, so it does provide you a little bit of buffer if you want to, if you do end up using some magicka-based abilities. So, for example, Necromancers, if you're using Boneyard, the additional spell damage and max magicka will give your Boneyards a little bit of an edge compared to Orcs. Not really enough to bridge that gap, but still something to consider. So, and in addition, Dark Elves are pretty good if you want to flip-flop between stamina and magic DPS. Other good races are what I like to call the sustain races. So those are the Redguards, Imperials, and the Wood Elves. All three of them get 2,000 max stamina. Redguards get 990 stamina back whenever they deal damage every couple of seconds. Wood Elves get 258 additional stamina regen. And the Imperials get 333 health, stamina, and magicka back whenever they deal damage every few seconds, and they get 3% cost reduction to all abilities. So those three races don't have the weapon damage bonus that Orcs and Dark Elves have. They exchange that for some additional sustain, which might be more beneficial for you. It kind of depends on how well you're able to sustain already. Finally, if you kind of want to go for a jack-of-all-trades sort of build, you could also go with Khajiits as well, because they get pretty balanced stats across the board. 825 magicka health stamina, 85 stamina regen, 85 magicka regen, 100 health regen, and 10% crit damage and crit healing. So if you kind of want to flex around your different roles, you could also go with Khajiits. In terms of attributes, all points are into stamina in order to maximize DPS. If you need some more survivability, you can shift some points into health. Generally speaking, you want to hit around 17.5, 18k max health with Ebon and Minor Toughness. That is with food, with those two buffs in a raid. That's just to help survive any sort of unavoidable damage that might end up being a one-shot if your health is too low. In terms of food, I was parsing earlier, so I am using parse food. However, depending on your sustain, you might want to run our Artaeum Takeaway Broth, which is sustain food, so it gives you health, stamina, stamina regen, and health regen. Or Dubious Camoran Throne, which is basically a slightly weaker version of Artaeum Takeaway Broth. That is also a lot cheaper to buy and to make. If you're able to sustain a full light attack rotation without using this food, then you're going to want to go with buy stat food instead, which gives you max health and max stamina. You will be losing out on the regen there, and with sustain being fairly low in Dragonhold, it might not necessarily be worth running by stat food. It really depends on how well you're able to sustain, how long the fights are, how good your group support is, and that kind of stuff. For Mundus Stone, going with the Shadow, still the strongest Mundus in the game for DPS. For champion points, so your CP points are going to shift a little bit based on class, just because you do have different ratios of damage types for different classes. More on that in the class-specific videos. But in general, green CPs and red CPs are going to remain pretty much exactly the same. So for green CPs, 100 Mooncalf, 75 Tenacity, just to give you some more stamina if you do need to heavy attack at all. The remaining 95 points can be placed wherever you'd like. So I have 31 Shadow Ward, 31 Tumbling, and 33 Warlord, for example. So for blue CPs, so I'm on a Necromancer right now, so I do have additional penetration bonus. So my penetration CPs are going to be lower compared to some other classes. So for example here, for Necromancers, I have 56 Mighty, 36 Piercing, 66 Precise Strikes, 40 Thaumaturge, 72 Master at Arms. If you are not a necromancer, you're going to have more points into piercing. If you're running a sharpened two-handed, you're going to have less into piercing. So there's a lot of different shifts that might happen based on your specific class. So again, this is very necromancer specific, dual wield necromancer specific, I should mention. So the specific blue CPs will be kind of expanded upon in the class specific videos. Finally, our red CPs could be consistent across all classes. So I have 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick-Skinned, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. This gives you sort of a balanced mitigation across all pieces of content. Doesn't necessarily maximize mitigation for a single trial. So for example, Maw of Lorkhaj has different red CPs to maximize mitigation compared to Halt's Fabrication. Most raid leads will have access to the red CPs that are going to maximize mitigation for your trials, so ask your raid lead for the specific red CP setup, or you can just go with this. This is pretty balanced, pretty decent across the board, and will get you through pretty much everything in the game. I just realized I forgot to mention Overland sets. There are a handful of Overland sets that I want to mention. The first one is going to be Hunding's Rage, which is a 6-piece crafted set, base game. So it comes from the last zones and each of the 3 alliance zones. So this just adds straight up weapon damage. Static bonus, so you want to have this on the body ideally. Pretty just consistent, safe set to go for. So really good if you have no other sets to run for your stamina DPS. Maybe you just got started in stamina DPS. Easy to craft, easy, cheap, really nice set to get. Another good set would be Mechanical Acuity, which is another 6-trait crafted set, this time from the Clockwork City DLC, but you can still trade for it, you can still commission somebody to craft it for you. This is a hybrid set, so you will be losing out on 1 armor set bonus with that spell damage on the 3-piece. The 5-piece is pretty decent, pretty much gives you a chance for 100% crit strike chance for 5 seconds every 18 seconds whenever you deal direct damage. So it's going to be a little bit better on certain classes compared to others, just because some classes might have more sources of direct damage. Very similar to Hunding's Rage, very consistent set across all the patches in the game. Not necessarily going to give you the best DPS, but it is consistent and it is always a decent set to turn to. There's also a proc set, so you can run this as a front bar set as well. So if you're missing any front bar set, you could run Mechanical Acuity. Also gives some really nice bursts, so for very, very short fights, Mechanical Acuity is a very strong set here. And then we have one final set here, which is one of the new sets from Southern Elsewhere. It is a crafted set, requires 9 traits to craft. I do need to pull it from the bank fast. And this is called New Moon's Acolyte. So again, 9 trait crafted set, so you do need to be a master crafter to craft this, but because it is a crafted set, you can commission somebody to craft it for you, or buy it off of guild traders. This is a true and blue hybrid set here. So you get weapon, spell crit, weapon, spell damage, physical, spell, penetration, weapon, and spell damage. The downside is, in exchange for the 481 weapon and spell damage, you get an increase to your cost of your abilities of 5%, which is actually quite substantial, and it does cut into your sustain for quite a bit. If you combine this with a race like Red Guards, or combine this with something like Viscous Serpent, it could be a very strong set to run. Static bonus, so ideally you want to have it on the body, but if you're running something like Viscous Serpent with New Moon Acolyte, both of them are ideally going to be body sets, so you're going to have to pick one of them to be a front bar set. So that's kind of the downside of running New Moon Acolyte with Viscous Serpent. Very good set, especially because it does add the physical penetration bonus, but the additional cost to sustain is a little bit too much of a hit for a lot of classes, so good, but only if you build around it, which might not necessarily be the best route to go for certain classes. But that is pretty much everything to cover in this video. Again, this is just gear and just things that are consistent across all different classes in the game. For class-specific rotations and skill setups, you will want to go to those specific videos as they're released throughout the week. If you have any questions about anything that was covered in this video, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Down in the description below, I will also list all the sets that I talked about, as well as whether they are front bar sets or body sets, and where to get them. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.